George Cooper. Oh, when I got out of high school, my dad's business had gone sour, and so we didn't have quite as much money as we used to have. But we were still reasonably well off. But my sister was at KU, and she got through, but Dad said, "You boys are going to have to earn your own way." So he did. He was in the import-export business at that time, and he knew some of the shipping people, so he said, "I can get you on a freighter." I said, well, he'd done that for my brother, my older brother. So I got a job on this freighter, a Danish freighter. And I'd gotten as far as Tokyo, Yokohama, I guess. And Denmark was invaded. So as far as the Japanese were concerned, they were aligned with the Germans. It was about a week. That time I met people, and they were very sociable and very polite. In fact, one girl that was on the docks one time, she sang, "You are my sunshine, my only sunshine." I mean, they had adopted things from the West. I had to find some other way out. I had earned a few dollars, enough to be able to take a passenger ship out of the States. I was just 20 at that time. That was about 1940, and in early 1941 that I thought I had enough to start. I was going to enroll at KU in the fall of 1941. It was that same time that I fell in love with a girl that I now call my wife. And I figured out that she could help me get through the school with her secretarial training and finding a job while we went to school together. But one of the reasons that I switched instead of enrolling at KU, I'd been reading about the Eagle Squadron in Britain, how U.S. pilots and men were joining up with them, and I felt certain that we were going to be in war. So I felt that I'd much rather be a pilot in that war, in a way excited about the events of the Eagle Squadron pilots in Britain. Of course, I didn't recognize how many of them died before the war ended, but I found out what was needed. I had to pass an exam, not only a health exam, but also you might say, an educational exam. So just to make sure, I heard that Wayne University, I was up in Detroit at the time, had a short 3-month course to assist in preparation for that exam. It's about the same exam for West Point. And I took the exam in November of 1941 and passed, and so I was just waiting on the opening of the next class for the aviation cadets, which turned out to be January, and of course by that time the Japanese had hit Pearl Harbor. But it took me until September, about the first week of September 1942, to graduate from flying school. I joined the Army Air Corps through the Aviation Cadet Program, graduated from fighter school in Victoria, Texas, before I was assigned to B-25s in South Carolina, Columbia, South Carolina. It was there that I got to train in B-25s, and eventually our unit was moved to New Guinea. The first primary was in Cimarron Field, Oklahoma. The second was at Randolph Field in San Antonio. We were flying what they called a primary trainer at the time, which was the maker escapes me for the moment, but it had about a 200 horsepower engine. And you had your initial training in being able to fly level, recognize a stall, and fundamentally some of the maneuvers like loop-the-loops and barrel rolls and snap rolls. As a matter of fact, I loved flying that airplane. I think it only cruised at around 120 miles an hour, but it was very flyable, you might say. In fact, one time I decided to show off a bit, so I rolled over and flew upside down across the field. But in that plane too, I had to have cushions behind me. I couldn't get close enough to the pedals. And as I was gotten over the field, the catch on the seat dropped a little bit, and it frightened me a minute, and I let go of the stick. The push cushion I had fell out, and in other words, I started holding on to the cockpit side, and I made a sloppy roll out then. I don't know that anybody ever saw it, because I never had any comment from anybody that they surely would have seen that pillow flying off, because I think I was flying about, well, it was probably in the order of at least 3,000 feet. But at any rate, when I got to fighter school, I was expecting to be a fighter pilot, which is what I really wanted to do. But they wanted more pilots for training, and 75% of the class was required to go to training new pilots. The only number that they put into fighter school of P-38s was about 10% of the class. And then the remainder then, they wanted to go to B-25s. And you can imagine why we had accidents. You know, you don't have many. In fact, I graduated from flight school with only 200 hours. And then you go back and train somebody and you only have 200 hours yourself. I was looking at some statistics not too long ago, and it confirmed what I believed, that about 50% of all the pilots that were killed, or air crews members, were not killed in battle. They were killed in accidents and, you might say, some foolish stunts, and a lot by weather alone. In those days we didn't have good weather forecasts. We didn't have flying aids in many areas. In fact, when I was still flying, well, they still had airway lines shown by lights that put out a signal lights. And so it was common at night flying visually that you flew your routes around Kansas by way of a light lane, you might say. And of course it was worse overseas. You didn't have that even overseas. So not only you didn't have the electronic means, in other words the radio guidance stations, and of course we definitely didn't have GPS in those days. And so whenever we got into bad weather, it could be a real task in getting home. Your airfield that you had didn't have any didn't have GCA, and many of them didn't have any kind of radio-controlled means. And in fact, I think I mentioned to you one time that there was one mission, fortunately I wasn't on, where they lost out of a group, two groups that participated, 20 aircraft because of the weather. Normally you have about 36, that's what we normally flew. There were more than that, but you didn't fly the entire group all the time. So there were about 72 airplanes out there, all looking for a place to land. San Antonio, Texas was where Randolph Field is. And they had, at Randolph, we had the first North American airplane, a BT-14. They're the manufacturers. And it brought us up to about a 400 power engine, I think it was. It still had fixed gear, but it had more power, and I guess the basic idea was to well, fly something with a little more powerful than the other one. Plus we engaged in a lot more night flying. We didn't do any night flying in primary. You had a little tail wheel and then the two main wheels. And those are really a little harder to set down nicely. You had to know exactly when to cut your power to make a nice perfect landing, which was a lot different from the tri-wheel, because the tri-wheel airplane like the B-25, you could come in and with a little bit of power still on there and touch your wheels, your main wheels, and then you can drop the nose. But to make a good controlled landing with the tri-wheels, or the one with a rear wheel, or tail draggers as you say, to make what you'd call a perfect landing, you just about had to land all three touching about the same time. Cadets would bounce an airplane. He'd go down. The other thing about the learning with a single engine was you had to remember about the torque, both on landing as well as takeoff. If you didn't correct for the torque with your rudders, you'd just go off the field. And if you didn't remember that torque and know when to adjust for it as incoming landing as you land, you could still loop the plane down the runway. There was no way to actually drive it on the ground. In other words, you didn't have any kind of a control that would do it. And if you brake too suddenly, that whole tail would, if you didn't brake evenly, the tail might switch one way or the other. In fact, I did make one ground loop in one flight. I didn't get on the, you don't have power control either, there's just one. But you have to guide it lightly with your brakes to keep it going. And if somehow you don't do that gently enough, you might put a little more brakes on one side, and if that tail started to swing, it might just swing clear around. And for a while they were calling me ground loop coot. But most of the time we didn't have too many cases of ground looping. Well, the B-25 had tricycle landing gear. And it was very easy to come in. It wasn't as touchy, you might say, to land. because you could drop the nose right away and you'd get full control. And of course, you did have adjustments of the power if you wanted to. Now we put in about, I guess in the initial phase where you had an instructor in B-25, well, it's pretty much the same thing in the other planes. In primary, by the time you had 10 hours flying, well, they were ready to turn it over to you and let you go ahead on your own. It was an exhilarating feeling, you know, when you first take off all by yourself. A little bit scary, particularly landing. It wasn't so bad as taking off, but when you came into land, well, you wondered, well, particularly knowing that you could lose control and ground loop. No, in fact, I flew the C-46 and also the C-47, both transport planes with the tail wheel. And they could be hard to land in a crosswind. In fact, I almost had an accident coming in just before a thunderstorm, and the winds had kind of whipped up, and the winds caught the wing and threw the plane off to one side just as I was landing. I flew the C-46 and also the C-47, both transport planes with the tail wheel. And they could be hard to land in a crosswind. In fact, I almost had an accident coming in just before a thunderstorm, and the winds had kind of whipped up, and the winds caught the wing and threw the plane off to one side just as I was landing. I met my crew shortly after I was assigned as first pilot to the 345th. But they kind of came in pieces, you might say. My co-pilot was assigned probably the next week or just a matter of days. And so was my bombardier. And we probably had a full crew within a week's time, because they were funneling in people there, and the administration and group administration was deciding where these people were going to go. So you didn't get the whole crew immediately right there. But well, for the B-25 we had pilot, co-pilot, radio operator, and a top gunner. A bombardier. The initial B-25 had a bottom turret that was operated by the radio operator, in addition to his function as in communications. And the lead aircraft would always have a navigator instead of they would have a navigator and a bombardier. 345th Bomb Group. Well, a bomb group, and I think it still is comprised normally of 4 squadrons. And I was assigned to the 499th Squadron. There was also the 498th, the 500th, and the 501st Squadron. And each one of those was commanded by a squadron commander, usually of major rank, and your group commander was normally a full colonel. Later on, started in the European sector, the squadron commanders were raised to lieutenant colonel, but the group commanders stayed as colonels, full colonels. Well, it depended. In a B-25, we probably had no more than about 250 people. Well, you had a full complement to be able to operate on your own. In other words, we still had supply, we had food service, we had medical, 16 to a squadron, I say. And there were 4 squadrons in the group. I think that's a little different when, well, I'm sure there's differences now in what comprises a squadron or group. And part of it deals with what types of aircraft. Through initial phase of training of the crews, not only the pilot. And when that was completed, we left Columbia, South Carolina, and were sent to Walterboro as a complete unit to work as a complete unit. Columbia, South Carolina was an overall training base for pilots and that might go overseas as replacement or were formed in additional groups. The unit was formed, 345th was formed in November of 1943. But the planes that we eventually flew overseas were over at Savannah, Georgia. But using the older planes, which were Cs, B-25Cs, that we took to Walterboro, we trained as a group, try to function, you know, as a complete group. It was also in connection with simulated orders from group headquarters and how they communicated with the squadrons and how fast the squadrons would receive it and how fast we got off and responded, that sort of thing. And I don't remember how long we were there, but probably not more than a couple of months. And then they had us go over to Savannah to pick up our new planes. And these were the Ds. So I already had my crew when we were in Columbia, South Carolina. And we were then in Walterboro. Again, it was a test of how well we received information, how fast we could get in our planes, and how fast we could respond to whatever orders we had. And then we had, it was probably in late March or early April that we got our orders to go to the West Coast. At first, we were slated to go to Europe, and then there was some chatter about going to Alaska. In fact, they issued us wool, well, what should I say, the flying suits with the leather and wool inside, you know. And the story was that General Kenny, who was the commander in the Pacific Theater, managed to convince Arnold and his staff to give them another group of B-25s. I think you probably read the story of what the concentration was going to be in Europe first. Well, at any rate, the tactics were at the time was to put our main emphasis on Europe. And then as they accumulated more supplies and crews and built up our units, that the Pacific Theater would get more aircraft as well as crews. A-25s in operation there, and they eventually had A-26s operating and A-20s. All of those aircraft participated in the B-26 and the B-24 in Europe. They were anxious to get any kind of an airplane that they had to finish that war. In fact, we were supplying Russia at those times, the P-39. P-38 is the only twin-engine fighter they had. That's what I wanted to fly, but I didn't get to. The key thing was, I think, that you had more power and more flexibility in terms of losing an engine and going back and getting back home. In fact, on one mission that we had, there was a P-38 that latched onto our group as we were returning after the mission. It was flying on only one engine. But is flying on one engine, he could still keep up with our B-25s that were flying on two engines. So they had a lot more power with two engines, and the pilots loved it. The only problem sometimes was in bailing out, because then you had twin tails but normally they'd bail out by rolling over. They gave me a key to the airplane, told us where it was, and we went out there, the co-pilot and I and flight engineer, I think there were just three of us then. And all the books on the airplane were in the airplane already, and they just said, check it out. I think they gave me some kind of an itemized thing that we should know that we have in the plane. It was this dull greenish gray. Didn't have any particular special coloring. I think as I recall, the bottoms might have been somewhat grayish, supposedly to blend with your upper, and the top part was more or less greenish to obscure somebody looking down on you from the vegetation of the ground. The engines one of the engines hadn't quite checked out of the mag check, but I wasn't wanting to stay back. I figured, well, it's a new airplane, there shouldn't be anything wrong with this thing. So we went on there, and we left probably the noon time or something like that. But the weather report was for a front crossing in the vicinity of Macon, Georgia, and all the way across the country. And they said there would be thunderstorms in the front, but the weather officer said, you don't have to worry about them, you'll be able to see them in spite of the fact that there was a lower level and a higher level of clouds. So when we took off, I did get up to 8,000 feet and found that there was an opening, you might say. But as I got closer to Macon, Georgia, the two cloud layers came together. So I was on total instruments when we hit that front. And when we hit it, the plane just went crazy. I mean, it was, you can't believe your instruments in a thunderstorm, because all these pressures within that thunderstorm will negate any accuracy. And the climb indicator was just kind of roaming around, and the altitude indicator was also going back and forth. And all I was trying to do is to hold the flight indicator. There's a little, I think it works on a gyro, so it's not dependent upon electrical or pressure. and just trying to keep that image of an airplane level, because the plane was just all over the place. And at the same time I realized I'm not going to try to go through this whole front. I'd likely hit, if I get through this thunderstorm, there are going to be more thunderstorms out there. So I dropped the nose and started down, making a U-turn back to the base. And I dropped down because I wanted to get down. I knew that there was a lower, the first cloud layer didn't completely come down to the ground, so I wanted to get out of all that bad weather and down where I could see things. And I knew pretty much what the terrain was, so I wasn't afraid of mountains in that particular area. And we did break out, and I just went on to the base. I wasn't going to try to go through any more of that weather. When we landed, I started to get out of my seat, and my legs were just shaking like that. I didn't realize what the tension was until I tried to get out, so I had to sit there for a minute to let my legs calm down. But you can imagine everything in the cockpit was flying over the place. My Steve, my bombardier, was not buckled in, and he flew up into the ceiling and cracked his head on the light dome in the navigator's compartment and crumpled up on the floor. Fortunately, he wasn't seriously injured, but the next day, when the flight engineer gave his report to me when I came up, and he says, we were almost out of oil in both engines. At any rate, we flew our airplanes to McClellan Field in California, where they put in a big Bombay tank. I think it carried 600 gallons of gasoline for our flight to Hawaii. After our Bombay tanks were put in, we flew over to Hamilton Field, which was north of, pretty much on the coast and north of San Francisco. And I think the following day is we got our briefing on weather, and we're supposed to take off. And they went through the weather with us, and then said, well, we can't release you right now. It says the weather looks pretty good, but what we have to wait on is a report back on winds. And they said that one flight that had gone ahead of us had to ditch because of high winds. They didn't make it to Hawaii. I didn't ask them whether they found the crews or not, but at any rate, so they held us there in operations until close to midnight. And finally they said, well, they had ships out there too that they could contact, and the ships could give them a sense of what the winds were. So they were just waiting on a report for the kinds of winds that needed to get us there, not oppose us. We left close to midnight, and San Francisco was dark because they had had some kind of a warning at one time. And the flight back was pretty much without any incident, except that when initially we'd been up so long, I told the co-pilot, I said, well, one of us has got to go to sleep. And I said, you want to take the first watch or second watch? And the co-pilot told me, Bill Park, he said, why don't you go rest first and I'll stay up. I told him in 2 hours, give me 2 hours. Well, when I woke up, and I don't think it was after 2 hours, it was before then, my co-pilot was asleep. My navigator was asleep. I don't think the radio operator was asleep, but he wouldn't know where the plane was. But those are just, let's see, that would give us 4 people. We were only 4 people, and the rest of the crew had to go by boat. But fortunately, we'd only lost 500 feet and 5 degrees. We were off by a few degrees. And I guess all of us stayed awake then until we hit. I was flying from San Francisco to Hawaii. It's about 2,400 miles. And we did good time. In fact, we really had at least 2 hours of fuel left when we got there. I think we spent about at least a week, I don't remember exactly. And we didn't see too much evidence of all the damage, except you could see it on some of the buildings that they still had shell holes where they were. And of course the Arizona was still there, and there might have been some other relics, but they cleaned it up pretty well. That was in about 1.5 years, I think. But we spent probably not over a week while they changed the Bombay tanks again. And then we were to take off for Christmas Island, again singly. One interesting thing is one of the other pilots who had actually graduated from the same flying school as I did, Cliff Bryant, was quite a card player, and he often won. Well, we both had breakfast about the time we were both going to leave, and there was one of these run-iron bandits. So he put a dime in it and pulled the trigger, and all these dimes rushed out, and he stuffed them in his pockets and went on. He took off before I did, and later when I left Canton Island going to the Fijis, I found that he had left the Fijis and disappeared. They never heard from him again. So there are a lot of dimes in the ocean someplace. But I started to take off, and one of the engines started backfiring, so I went back to the maintenance line, and they found in that short period of a week or so that a bird's nest had been built in the air intake of one of the engines.